My mum used that on her lips. You want me to put that on my todger?
Hello, hi everyone, I'm Hayley. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about my favorite nonfiction books. Specifically, I'm going to be recommending you books that you can and should read instead of reading Spare. I haven't read it, but we all know the monarchy and the British are not the best. And I just think that you could put your money in better places. And also this excerpt, it was enough to tell me what I needed to know. People are gonna make their own decisions, that's fine. I'm here to tell you why you should read other books. Yeah, let me actually show you the clip.
My penis was oscillating between extremely sensitive and borderline traumatized. The last place I wanted to be was Frostnipistan. I'd been trying some home remedies, including one recommended by a friend. She'd urged me to apply Elizabeth Arden cream. My mum used that on her lips. You want me to put that on my todger? It works, Harry, trust me. I found a tube, and the minute I opened it, the smell transported me through time. It felt as if my mother was right there in the room. Then I took a smidge and applied it down there.
You cannot have waterboarded that information out of me, especially for the entire world to know, because you know damn well the entire world is out here trying to read this book. Like, listen, and I know a lot of people are very, very, very sympathetic about, you know, this man and his family because of everything they've put Meghan through. Like, this is not about him. This is about Meghan, okay? Like, I read a book about Meghan, but Harry, he still supports the monarchy. You know what? Let's not get into it. You don't need to know anything else about this man. So I'm here to tell you about other memoirs and nonfiction books you should read instead of reading Spare or Prince Harry's book. Trust me, I think your life will actually be better. Let's get into it. So the first book I have is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is one of my favorite books of all time. This is a memoir written by the victim of the Stanford sexual assault case. I feel like you should just go into it with just that knowledge alone and just let Chanel Miller tell you her story, because it is her story. And one of the reasons why she wrote this book was because there's so many different perceptions and different ways that her story was being told for her. And so with this book, she's reclaiming her identity and just her place in the world, especially after being put on blast in a way that was totally against her will. And so this book highlights that. It highlights her story. It highlights the injustices within the criminal justice system, and as well as what a lot of sexual assault victims go through and how the court process can just be re-traumatizing all over again. And I feel like especially men should read this book because they don't understand what women or non-men go through. It's really hard to read, but it is so good. Chanel Miller's writing is beautiful and it's so soul-bearing, the way that she lays out her story. And I mean, it goes from before the attack to during the attack to after, trying to heal, trying to find justice and find peace, and dealing with all the people who don't believe her and all the people who are trying to make her out to be someone that she isn't. It's just powerful to get her personal experience and the story in her own words. I feel like so many times we feel close to victims and certain court cases through the way that they are publicized in the news or whatnot and online, but you don't really get the truth until you're actually hearing it from the actual person's words. It's just phenomenal. I love it. Untamed by Glennon Doyle. This is another memoir. I just remember reading it and feeling so seen, and also just feeling so relieved and almost kind of happy that there was someone who was willing to talk about these kind of intense thoughts that a lot of women have but might be too afraid to actually voice them. And so it was really cool to just read about someone discovering their sexuality later in life than a lot of people tend to kind of come out or figure out their true selves, and then what it's like to almost uproot your current life in order to slip into your real skin and to feel like your true self. I don't know, I just love the commentary on how the world perceives women, not just when they're older, but literally from birth, and how they're raised with so many expectations and so many judgments that they have to combat. And it was just nice to see it put out there without any sugarcoating. This book was very honest and vulnerable, and it was really interesting to see someone dealing with them coming to terms with their sexuality a bit later in life, and how that not only shapes them but also shapes their relationships with other people and how they decide they want to live the rest of their life. This is a really fascinating read. You have to keep in mind Glennon Doyle is a white person, so it isn't like the most intersectional read, but she definitely does touch on BIPOC experiences and how she knows that it's completely different for them coming out and, you know, being a woman, especially in the US. She talks about the Black Lives Matter movement and how being a queer BIPOC is an experience that no one except them will know. Like, white queers will never understand that. It was nice to see her acknowledge that. Obviously, as a queer Black woman, I took her words with a grain of salt, but it was cool to see someone speak up and to voice a lot of concerns that a lot of women are having in a very, very engaging way. It was great. I loved it. Next up, I have In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is another memoir, and this one is unlike any memoir I've ever read in my life. It is written in such a hauntingly beautiful but devastating way. It basically details Carmen Maria Machado's experience in their first queer or sapphic relationship that involves domestic abuse. One reason why I really love memoirs is how personal and up close and intimate they feel. And this is something I've never experienced. Like, I've never experienced a relationship, period, but then also a toxic, abusive relationship. I feel like so many people who haven't been through it like to speak on it, and they'll say a lot of things that might not necessarily be true, and they might just be assuming, especially because like it is a certain type of relationship. And so Carmen Maria Machado unpacks a lot of stereotypes that lesbian relationships tend to be overwhelmed with and tend to be written with. It's just so fascinating the way that she writes out this narrative, because it kind of reads like a horror because it is so terrifying what she goes through in this relationship, but it's also real life. Like, this is a memoir, it's nonfiction, but the way she writes it, I don't even know how to explain it. Like, you just have to read it. I feel like she totally redefined the memoir genre with this book. The writing is so beautiful, but it's also just so heartbreaking knowing that she went through this and that this is a very real reality for a lot of people. And for queer relationships, it's especially difficult to believe because people have so many expectations and preconceived ideas about what women look like and what women look like specifically in relationships or like queer relationships. And it's so interesting to see her kind of break down those ideas and redefine the expectations that people have about queer, specifically lesbian relationships. I love this book. This is one of my favorite books of all time. Check trigger warnings if you're going to read this. It's really hard to read, but I think it's also a very important read, especially if you are someone wanting to learn more about what queer love can look like and what it should look like versus what it shouldn't look like. Another memoir that I absolutely love is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I mean, it's a really brutal story about Jeanette McCurdy growing up as a child star and having this really awful, toxic, abusive relationship with her mother. I thought the whole story, like the whole book, was really brave of her to write, especially in a society where mothers are totally made out to be these angels 24/7. And it's like no matter what they do, because they're moms and because we have these ideas that moms are like the hardest working people ever and, you know, they can never do any wrong, like it's hard to see them in any kind of light that is not making them out to be an amazing, perfect angel. It was really nice to see Jeanette McCurdy kind of like dismantle that idea and shine the light on what it looks like when you hold mothers up to this expectation and kind of refuse to see them in any other way. So like for Jeanette McCurdy, her mom was her best friend and her mom was that person who like raised her and who took care of her when she was younger, and so she only ever thought that she could love her mom and like appreciate her. So her mom did all these horrible things to Jeanette, but Jeanette just kind of like felt like she had to accept it because like that's her mom and her mom is her person. And it took her a really long time to grow and realize that she was being abused and that this is not normal treatment or behavior from someone who is supposed to love you. It still is a controversial memoir and title because a lot of people are like, well, it doesn't matter what you've been through, like that's your mom, like you have to love her and forgive her. And it's like, how can you say that after knowing what terrible trauma this person has gone through? Jeanette McCurdy went through all these terrible things, what with being forced to take certain substances and being coerced into these awful sexual situations and exploitative positions through acting and different entertainment roles, and then the eating disorder she developed because of the guardian, her mother, putting all these ideas into her head. And it's like the fact that some people can read that and still step back and be like, but she still shouldn't say all these terrible things about her mom. I'm like, why not? She did those terrible things. Just because she is a mother doesn't make her exempt from accountability. Just because your mother is your mother doesn't mean that she is exempt and absolved from being recognized as a terrible, harmful person. And so it was really nice to see someone like be super honest about that. It must have been really hard, but I mean, it totally makes me see her in a new light. I feel like we all have ideas about child stars and everything that they go through, but this totally solidified that the industry is not a safe place for anyone but children and like young girls and young women especially. Love that book. That is totally another memoir you should read instead of Spare. Another memoir I recommend is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This is another memoir that emphasizes family dynamics and what it can be like to grow up in tough situations and what it takes to heal from them and what it's like taking that baggage and that trauma into adulthood and trying to deal with that later. I think Crying in H Mart is especially impactful, or at least it was for me, because it is another BIPOC story, and it specifically is about growing up Korean American and losing her mother and learning how to develop her own identity and how to deal with all these external pressures and expectations. I still have my mother in my life, but this memoir hit so hard on the front of losing your mother. It's so real. Like, I sit here and think about it all the time. I'm like, well, what am I gonna do like when I lose my mom or like my parents or anyone? But it's also so necessary to acknowledge those moments that were less than great and maybe a bit toxic, because they're always going to impact you. No matter how much you ignore those moments, they're still going to have some kind of influence over your life. And the sooner you acknowledge them and try to heal and unpack every way that they influenced you, the better off you will be in the end. It dealt with so many things. Feeling othered, like being Korean American in a world that is obsessed with labels and othering people that aren't just the standard white ideal. It was interesting to see how Michelle Zauner dealt with that and how that really impacted her identity and how she began to grow distant from her Korean identity and how she was able to like reforge that as she grew up. It's really easy to see myself in this book, knowing that like I went to predominantly white school. I've had to be the only black person in the room before, and it can be weird to find your identity when you see no one else that looks like you. It was so fascinating to see someone be forced to reckon with their identity. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I totally understand why it's so popular. The next book that I have to recommend is not a memoir, it is a nonfiction book, and that is The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. This is basically like the origin story for black people in the US, because I mean 1619 is the year that the first African slave was brought to the US. I've talked about this book so many times, but I feel like this should be required reading for everyone. It has a lot of different essays and poems and inputs and like short stories from a lot of different black authors. It's incredible to see a lot of different people's perspectives on the subject matter, but I think like there's so much in this book that is not taught in school, and I'm like, I feel like I have the right to know this information. It can be hard to read because it talks about missed opportunities and like what could have happened to black people, like where would black people be now if XYZ hadn't happened, or if we had gotten XYZ like reparations or land or whatever. And it's just so fascinating to see history almost like written for the first time, because so many people like to ignore what black people went through and how they've gotten to this place in modern times. It's sad in some places because it's like we could be at a completely different standing if we obviously had been treated better, but if we had been given what we were deserved, considering the amount of work that we put into building this country. I feel like people get scared to pick up that book because they're like, it's a textbook, and I'm like, but this is necessary knowledge that everyone should have, especially non-black people. Last but not least, I have White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. This is another book about race. It is not a memoir. It is a nonfiction book. This one is more so focused on women of color and how white women are able to weaponize their tears and guilt against women of color, and how white feminism is a disease and very harmful for the feminist movement in general, but specifically in leaving out women of color. This is why talking about nonfiction books is so hard because there's so much to talk about and I don't have enough time to talk about everything. The main idea is that the general feminism movement leaves out women of color, which is a large part of our demographic and our community and our society, our world. This idea in general that women of color don't feel the same pains and struggles that white women go through, and so white women just kind of ignore us. And also there's this idea that I feel like because women in general are seen to be not as harmful, at least compared to men, that the bad things that they do are ignored because we're like, oh, it can't be that bad, like they're just a woman. And that is argued to make them even more powerful because a lot of their terrible actions are kind of flown under the radar and ignored. And so people underestimate the power of white women's words and specifically their tears and their emotions. But if you look back in history, you can see how many times a white woman's tears have gotten a black person killed or in some kind of great danger. This book, I also believe, should be required reading for everyone. Those are all the books that I have to recommend. Honestly, I feel like most nonfiction I read, I really enjoy, but these actually are some of my favorite books of all time, and I feel like more people should read them. Adding to that well of knowledge, it's very useful and I think very necessary in life. I also talk about books like these, fiction and nonfiction, on my social media all the time, so you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. Everything is linked down below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Please comment any nonfiction book recs that you have for me. I'm really interested in reading about intergenerational trauma and how trauma changes our brain chemistry, specifically for Black women. Thinking of a book like The Body Keeps the Score, except by a woman of color or a Black woman specifically. That's it. If you read these books, I'd love to know your thoughts on them. Thank you again for watching. Please remember to like this video, comment down below, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time with another video. Bye.